Explained by the Billy Meier contacts. Mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Emmanuel, the Jesus Christ, Jesus. See also Antichrist, 666. The Beast. See also King Arthur. The Holy Grail. See also Shroud of Turin. The Veil of Veronica. See also Talmud Jmmanuel. Ask its acquaintanceship.
That occurred to me now, and I wondered about Svatha's words, that everything is only meant to be a deception, that Jesus Christ should never have been called Jesus Christ, rather Emmanuel, that he was not God's son, and that God is not creation. Ask its explanations, Part 1.
3rd February, 1953 Awamd. In less than 20 Earth years, the time will come for you when you will write a great work of the truth that will be transmitted to you from a very, very high spirit form. It will reach to you from the same level from which Emmanuel, the carpenter's son, who you wrongly named Jesus Christ, also received his knowledge. 191. The true utensils of Emmanuel and also the cross are already long rotted away and decayed to dust. You will learn the truth about Emmanuel, who you wrongly call Jesus Christ. You will recognize the truth regarding his prophecies that he pronounced less than 2,000 years ago, because he spoke of metal machines which would move in water and on land and in the air. Ask its explanations, Part 4.
Indeed, Jesus said.
That is precisely what he did not even say. It is all a deliberately falsified tradition. Besides, the man never bore the name Jesus. He was plainly and simply called Emmanuel. Ask its explanations, Part 5.
Ever. But the remainder gave him Ilyich Jitchi Ustinov, the truth about the life and work of Emmanuel, when Asket led us back to the year 32 in order to, there and then, examine those events which are described so wrongly and counter to reality in the New Testament of the Christian Bible. Events concerning Emmanuel, which, during 2,000 years, were so malevolently falsified that a mass psychosis arose from it, as did a further religion, Islam, as well as many sects which were able to be constructed from it. Ask its explanations, Part 6.
14th February 1953 Woon. The intention is to lead you back to the year 32, where you are to witness, there and then, those events the records of which have been handed down to you in false forms in the New Testament. This is required because you can only fulfill your mission when you know the actual truth in very great detail. But this is truly quite different from the way it is presented in your scriptures.
In no way can he himself, Emmanuel, do anything about being branded as a son of God, and still even greater nonsense. Because according to everything that I know today, he was used without his own will for the founding and maintenance of a new religion. Emmanuel must be a wonderful human and extraordinarily wise and clever as well.
He speaks the truth, Yichi. But now look there at the men who are coming along the path.
Who are the people then?
A very wise earth human with his followers.
I think I know which he is. The one there in the middle, the tall one who stands out over everybody.
You observe very precisely, it is he.
My teaching, which I spread in these lands, is not new, and it is well known to the scribes. But they falsify the old teaching of the prophets, which was handed down to them and is very learned. But they disdain and falsify it and interpret it to their own advantage. Therefore, they accuse me of lying because I preach against their lies. From the old teaching of the laws of creation and the spirit, they have set up erroneous cults which take freedom of consciousness from the human and drive him into servitude, whereby they can enrich themselves with his possessions. Truly, out of my true humanity, a cult will be set up, which will bring with it very bad and deadly consequences. Seen in me, however, is still only the human, which I truly also am, but soon a form of malevolence will be made out of me, and I will be equated with creation. Truly, I know these events of the future, and indeed I cannot change them, not even if I rebel against them. I was born a human, I live as such, and as such fulfill my appointed mission. But also as a human I will suffer the fate of corporal death in 83 years. By then, my body will be very old, yet my spirit and thinking will remain undiminished.
But I have fully understood your explanations, because I do know the New Testament, which allegedly contains your teaching. But for a short time now, I have known that the allegedly handed down teaching is only an evil falsification and only corresponds to the actual truth in very few things. Not at all to mention thereby regarding your own person, who has been pressed into a form of a god and a form of creation, and who is proclaimed as the Redeemer of earth humanity. You sit before me, and I see that you are precisely as much a human as is Asket here, as is Jitchi over there, and your brothers and students, who in our time are called disciples. Now I wonder how it has come about that no direct documentation of your teaching has been handed down, because, to my knowledge, the first words of the New Testament, which exists in my time, were written only around 200 years after your alleged death on the cross. Do you not write down any facts at all of your teaching in such a way that they can be kept for posterity?
Truly, your question is very precisely directed. Consider, my time is about 2 millennia before yours, and in this time only certain forms of society are literate. On account of my mission, I did also learn writing and reading, yet I have insufficient time to write down my teaching. And if I speak of my teaching, truly then I thereby name the teaching of all great ages, the teaching of the Spirit and the teaching of the laws and recommendations of creation, which are eternally imperishable. I learnt it in a similar way to you, and furthermore spent long years in the distant land of Kushnot from Billy, today part of North India, where I was permitted to experience further learning. So the teaching is indeed preached by me, yet it is truly not originally from me. Truly, your question is, however, warranted. I fully know the false and wrong teachings of the future about my true teachings and about my person. But no practical steps are planned to change these coming misleading events, because the mass of erring and falsifying humans is too great to be able to influence them even on a small scale. This will unfortunately lead to a false teaching of much longer than 3,000 years, and to very much need, pain, hate, misery, and bloodshed. Truly, in spite of that, however, the truth will not be lost, because it will, in a safe place, remain transmitted and also outlast the time in a written form. Among my followers, I have a literate man named Judas Iscariot, who writes down the most important parts of the teaching and events, which later, well preserved, shall outlast the time in order to hand down the actual truth to posterity. With the help of an ex-priest, these texts will be found by you, in your time, in Jerusalem, and you will spread them again, true to their meaning, and make them accessible to the humans. Already the texts are being sought now in order to destroy them and to use them as indictments against me. One scroll has already been stolen from the writer and kept closed by the Pharisees and the scribes. Judah Ihariot, a son of a Pharisee, secretly took it out of Judas Iscariot's bag in order to sell it to my persecutors for 70 pieces of silver, in order thereby to be able to charge me with blasphemy against God. But Judas Iscariot has been ordered by me to write the text once again, and now to keep it quite safe, whereby its purpose will outlast the ages.
You speak of Judas Iscariot, who is supposed to be your betrayer, as the texts of my time still convey, nonetheless falsified.
Truly I speak of him, but he will in no way be the guilty one. He who will hand me over to the persecutors is the same one who stole the texts and sold them.
Therefore Judah Iscariot?
So is it. But his father will spread the lie that Judas Iscariot is the betrayer, because the Pharisee name Iscariot must not be soiled. But the reason is also based on the fact that the priests, scribes, and Pharisees and their followers can say, "Behold, one from his own ranks has betrayed him and handed him over to a death on the cross. Behold, behold, how can his teaching be truth if his own people betray him and sell him?"
So that is the way it is. Now I understand quite a bit more. But now I ask myself, who then really hanged himself in Potter's Field? Respectively, who will hang himself there in the coming time?
Judah Iscariot. I know truly that in your time the people live in the mistaken belief that I am the embodiment of creation. So then, in your time, they call me the Anointed One, and they thereby wander far from every truth, through deep darkness engendered by belief.
But how is it now with yourself? I mean with your name. It is indeed Emmanuel, but in spite of that, in my time, you are called Jesus Christ. That is the way it is in the New Testament anyway.
Truly, that is an evil vituperation, which is foreign to every truth. Up until this point in time in which I talk with you now, this name has never been uttered. Only in a later time will it become coined by a human whose thinking will be confused. He will also bear the blame for me being designated as creation, and for the lie that I am omnipotent. All this will happen this way through Paul, who currently is still one of my worst enemies and is still named Saul.
You mean that through the construction of Christianity, he will found his own erroneous religion? A Paulism, so to speak?
Truly, you speak the truth.
What is your own position then in regard to the title Jesu, Christi, or Jesus Christ, which has been attributed to you?
In your time this name is very imprinted. Truly, truly, that aggrieves me greatly. Never do I wish to be so named, and it never should have happened. Yet this has become unavoidable for the path of development, because the human of this earth must first go into error in order to find the truth. As I hear, however, the name which is not appropriate to me, Jesus Christ, truly, this aggrieves me greatly, because it will be, without exception, uttered only by humans who still live in confusion regarding thinking and knowledge and have not yet come to terms with the truth. And they will unfortunately be very many at your time, and that is truly very sad and causes me pain.
You mean that only a misled human calls you Jesus Christ?
Truly, that is what I said, because every human who knows the truth will call me by my correct name, because for him the truth signifies life and knowledge.
Yet now tell me, is it very unwelcome to you if the people call you Jesus Christ, or similar?
Truly, you precisely understand the sense of my thoughts. This name is wrong when applied to me, and I am aggrieved to know that it will be used for me in the future. I bring the teaching of the truth of the great time, and thereby do not do wrong. If one, however, associates me in any kind of manner with this name, then one accuses me of wrong and of lying.
You are very sensitive, Emmanuel.
That is not so. It is only that this name, however, is not consistent with the sense of the truth, and it insults me.
But now it interests me whether the text mentioned by you, Talmud Jmmanuel, will really serve the truth in my time. I mean thereby the records of Judas Iscariot.
Truly it will be they. even if they will initially be greatly doubted. Initially, the accusation will be made that they are lies and a falsification, yet with time the truth will be victorious. Truly, very evil things against the text will be brought into play in order to revile it as lies and to destroy it. Very many paths will be trodden to that end. Out of foolishness, even lower spirits and the dead will be called upon, although that is impossible, in order to revile my teachings, newly presented by you, as lies, in the same way as do the scribes, the Pharisees, and the priests of my time, who are only able to come into contact with very lowly, ignorant, and misled humans and influence them by means of belief. So will it also be in your time, because the humans of your time will have succumbed just as much to delusional beliefs and ignorance as have the humans of my time.
What will be asserted then in order to put into question the genuineness of your teaching and the text, and to make the accusation that they are lies?
Truly, there will be very many paths trodden to that end. A new form of the lie will, however, be this: it will be asserted that the text is indeed very valuable and contains certain truths, yet it does not transmit my teaching. Rather, it is only the teaching of another who has also borne the name Emmanuel. It will even be doubted that I am Emmanuel, and I will be forced into another person's identity. This will result in association with the name Jesus Christ, malevolently given to me. It will be asserted that I, Emmanuel, would not be falsely named Jesus Christ, so it is supposed to appear that I, Emmanuel, and the person of Jesus Christ, who I am imputed to be, have been two different people. These further lies about me will be invented about me very early in your time. In your time you call the cult around me religion. Truly that is very well known to me. But this religion is interspersed with very many false teachings of manifold forms, as well as with duplicity about the time of my birth. In your time you celebrate the day of my birth on December 24th of any given year. But this is only the day of the festival of a bloodthirsty idol from the lands of the Parsa peoples. Note from Billy. Later Persia, called Iran since 1934, and does not come near to equating to the day of my birth. Your calculation of time truly does not correspond to reality, and therefore neither do your calculations about the time of my birth. According to your time's calculation of time, the day of my birth is determined as the third day of the second month.
You mean the 3rd of February?
This is what you designate this time.
You must indeed know it precisely. But why did this time difference come about?
On one hand, it was handed down wrongly, and on the other hand, through erroneous calculations and continual innovations, to the manner in which dates were calculated.
That is evident. But you have a manner of speech which I constantly hear from you, also which was quite obviously correctly handed down to my time, namely the word truly or truly, truly. On what basis do you always weave in this word, and what does it signify to you?
It is a quirk of mine for the strengthening of my words. Truly only a quirk such as every human possesses. One can express the sense of the word in different forms. By weaving in this word, however, you can circumvent many other descriptive words which often require long interpretations. Therefore I employ that word for the purpose, or for the strengthening, of "it is just as I say," "it is the truth," "it is actually so," "it is accurate."
But now, please just tell me how things stand with your teachings. How should they be described, and what is still correct within that which has been handed down? It is indeed said in the New Testament that you are the Son of God, and that God Himself embodies creation. Also, in these Testament texts, God is always even spoken of as the Heavenly Father, and you are spoken of as the Redeemer of mankind, and so forth. Everything is quite confused, and often even absolutely illogical and paradoxical.
Truly, you say it. I already told you that Judas Iscariot's text, which contained sections of my teaching, was stolen. This text will be the basis of all falsifications. Presently, they are also continued, in a falsified manner, by the Pharisees and scribes, and are not completed according to my teachings. The reason that this is happening is truly, however, only in order to falsify them now, and even more at a later time, to the point of being unrecognizable, and also to use them against me in court. As I therefore speak and teach of creation, the texts are being falsely modified in such a way that mendacious words are put into my mouth, and I am supposed to have spoken of a Father in heaven, the gathering of a host of angels, and many other false things. But I have never done that because these forms do not correspond to the truth. I have always faithfully spoken of the truth of creation as being of creation, and of God as being of God. God was never put on a level with creation by me, because God is a creature of creation, as are you and I and every other human. In his form, he is a king of wisdom and a ruler over human races, in the same way that a king or emperor also is a ruler over human races on earth. But creation is the immeasurable secret and the creation of every creation. It is omnipotence, knowledge, wisdom, love, omniscience, and being, and my teachings speak of it alone, when I talk of it and its laws and recommendations, and of the power of eternity. Translator's note, sentence 226 is omitted in the original. Truly, this alone is the truth and nothing else. But, in your time, when everything is handed down differently, then that corresponds to an evil deception and abominable falsification on the part of the twisters of the texts and false teachers. Truly, the point of the falsifications lies just in the slander against me from the side of the scribes, Pharisees, and priests, in order to have me die on the cross. But the further reason also lies in the fact that, through these false and twisted teachings, the humans of earth are to be beaten into serfdom so that they are caused to succumb to poverty in regard to knowledge and reason, whereby they will be able to be shamefully enslaved through belief so they can be exploited in evil ways.
Contact Report 001. Above all, there is only one thing that possesses the power over life and death of every creature. This is the creation alone, who has laid out her laws over everything, laws that are irrefutable and that have eternal validity. The human being may realize that a God can never assume the role of the creation or determine the destiny of the human being. A God is only a ruler and, moreover, a human being who mightily exercises rule or tyranny over his fellow human beings. God is not the creation, but only a creature of her, like all creatures dependent on the creation. However, the human being chases after his or her religious irrational belief and claims that God is the creation herself. But he or she goes even further and claims that an ordinary earth human named Emmanuel, who through deliberate error is also called Jesus Christ, would be the Son of God and would be the creation herself. Contact Report 008.
We have already spoken several times about the Talmud Jmmanuel. Emmanuel himself has over the course of the last 2,000 years fundamentally been used again and again as main religious figure. Is the intention of once again using this already long-dead human being to make a new belief direction, and an idol out of him? Is the Talmud Jmmanuel supposed to serve this purpose?
No. Emmanuel himself was just a human being like any other human being, which you know better than I do. He was just endowed with very great knowledge. He represents neither a symbol nor an idol nor anything else. He was certainly a teacher, a prophet of the spiritual and conscious-based knowledge and the essence of wisdom, but, however, nothing beyond that. Many life forms should also never be idolized or even worshipped, such as the human being is accustomed to do. A mistake of insanity shall not be made another time, with Emmanuel being regarded and idolized as the embodiment of the teaching that he brought. The truth of the Talmud shall be taught and recognized as such, without a calling into play the name of Emmanuel and his glorification. Important are only the truth and the laws, but not the person who brought this teaching, laws, and the truth. Hence, if a cult would be established around Emmanuel another time, then the purpose would not be fulfilled. The human being, Emmanuel, should not continue to be glorified, as solely the truth and the laws are of absolute importance.
Contact Report 010.
The date of birth of Emmanuel, the 3rd of February, calculated according to your Christian calendar.
Contact Report 023.
It is repeatedly claimed that procreation can also be done in spiritual form. Furthermore, the Christian religion also claims that Mary was impregnated by the power of the Spirit or by the Holy Spirit.
This is nonsense of malignant human imagination, created by morbidly thinking terrestrial men who press the truth of the Spirit into impossible paths in their morbidly exuberant imagination. Also, Mary, the mother of Emmanuel, was not impregnated by any spiritual powers or by the Holy Spirit. She interceded with the Son of Heaven Gabriel, and was impregnated by him at the higher command of the leader of the sons of heaven, who at that time ruled some earthly human races and bore the name Ish-Wish, that is to say, God.
Contact Report 031.
It is said on the earth, especially among the Christians, that Emmanuel, whom they call Jesus Christ, is, so to speak, the actual master of the world and the universe. He is supposed to be God incarnate, where this God is regarded as the creation. What do you say about this?
We know about these human delusions on your world. Alone, the idea of a Christ being and a Christ consciousness corresponds to a very evil and degenerate delusion of the earth humans, and a very ill-natured presumption, because if these things would have happened or would still happen in the future, which is absolutely impossible, because it truly is only a fantasy of delusional earth humans, then with absolute probability the race which would be given the task of disseminating a religion would not be the earth humans. As since many millennia on many worlds in the universe, the earth human stands in the entire universe as a purely materialistically developed life form, which solely represents a life form so deeply addicted to materialism that every consciousness-based evolution over millennia has been detrimental to this degree. On many of our own as well as on other foreign worlds, it is known that the earth human condemns any reasonable consciousness-based evolution and develops himself or herself only in malicious materialism and diverse religious delusions. And so it would be a paradox of the first order if, from all possible choices, a race so manifoldly incompetent in all consciousness-based areas would be chosen for a task of universal significance. But that the earth human, despite this fact, presents this allegation, represents on the one hand an immense arrogance, and on the other hand, it bears witness to his or her autocratic megalomania, which in both these forms cannot easily, or not at all, find an equal anywhere else in this or in another universe. Especially those religions and sects who in their heretical book name the prophet Emmanuel as Jesus Christ and worship him are the strongest opponents of the real truth. These are the Christian religions and sects. But also Islam and Hinduism, as well as Judaism, must be named as dangerous religions, and the same with certain parts of Buddhism, in which serious heresies come to light. Emmanuel was already aware of the coming of this time of terror, and so he refused to be called God, Jesus, or Christ, which was nevertheless officially done in 189. The designations God, Jesus, and Christ alone contain dangerous values, for each of these designations embodies death, ruin, and destruction. In particular, however, all three contain the triple value 6666, the number of the extinction of truth.
In former times, visible proofs were necessary for the human beings of the earth in order to impart certain forms of thought to them. But by these visible proofs, they began to believe in miracles, and at other times they went astray. The present time of the earth has progressed beyond visible evidence, and the path of clear and logical reason and equally clear and logical understanding alone must be followed. Only these values count for the present time, and they are the better evidence than all those which are visible. Today, the power of consciousness, knowledge, and wisdom and love are of utmost importance to be able to walk the path of evolution. In Emmanuel's time, however, it was different, for at that time the knowledge of earth humans was in every respect still very much imprisoned in those things which can be recognized by the eye and heard by the ears. At that time, this ensured that the human being who saw and heard visible evidence became aware of his power of thought and thereby progressed evolutionarily. Today, however, Earth humans have emerged from this stage, have acquired greater reason and intellect, and have become very conscious of their power of thought.
At the time of Emmanuel, there was also the factor to be considered that at that time no earth human being except Emmanuel himself was very highly developed in spirit and consciousness, which is why he had to demonstrate various happenings demonstratively. At that time, in earth humans, according to their lower state of consciousness, seeing led to clarification and the development of consciousness. Therefore, Emmanuel did all those things which today are so readily called miracles in your Christian religions.
Contact Report 038.
Well, you have now mentioned a word several times which is completely unknown to me. I mean, this real vision. What's the meaning of this?
I understand. Of course you cannot know that, because it's our own word composition for a certain form of guided vision. A real vision describes a certain form of a guided vision. It is a form of vision that is dominated by many intelligences, including the Giza intelligences. By these arbitrarily provocable and steerable visions, different extraterrestrials, and also we, influence life forms in order to obtain certain impressions for them in this way, which are instructive to them and which they are to make accessible by spreading also to others, in order to also purposefully affect the surroundings. These steerable visions are so massively realistic that the influenced life form becomes convinced that it has experienced the vision as reality. That's exactly why we call it real vision, because it seems so real. Every experience experienced through this real vision lasts as long as it would take in reality. Such real visions do not only last seconds or minutes, but they last as long, in time, as the real experiences would take.
That's fantastic. This means that a human being can have an experience that is in reality not an experience at all, but arises only from a fictitious vision, but that he or she is not able to distinguish this vision from reality, and thus regards the illusory experience as the truth of an experience. Applied in this form, it is not a deception, for the process serves to expand the truth in the life form in question. If Earth humans are influenced in this manner, then this happens only for the reason that they are not capable of experiencing the visionary experiences given to them in reality. I accept that. But now you said that these real visions last exactly as long as the real experience takes in time. So a lot of time could flow by and many hours could pass.
Sure, even days, weeks, or months.
Man, poor creatures will starve to death.
You forget that the vision seems very massively real.
You mean that the affected then feel their natural needs, like hunger and thirst or tiredness, etc.
Certainly.
But what do people eat and drink, and if they have long, real visions outside the house, where do they sleep?
It's very simple. In the state of real vision, they are master of many consciousness-based powers, which also slumber in their subconscious. They then apply these subconsciously in such a form that they condense matter through the thirst and hunger feeling and solidify exactly those edible and drinkable things that they experience in their real visions. That's how they eat. It is the same process as it was demonstrated 2,000 years ago by Emmanuel when he fed 250 people on earth. Tradition of 5,000 is wrong. There were only 250, with bread, which he multiplied in this manner. The difference lies only in the fact that people with real visionary influence apply their abilities subconsciously, while Emmanuel was able to generate them consciously.
Contact Report 039.
Okay, then I have another question regarding Mount Shasta. I have already talked about this with Sim Yase, but something still seems unclear to me. Sim Yase told me that distant descendants of the Hyperboreans now live in Mount Shasta, on the Aleutian Islands, and in Alaska. Enoch, however, and also Emmanuel, spoke of the winds between the east and west, or between the north and west. From this, I always thought that the Greenland of the Hyperboreans, so Hyperborea, must have been somewhere far up north, in Greenland or something. But now, this does not make sense anymore with Mount Shasta. What should I now think of this?
At the time of Enoch, the North Pole was situated differently than what is the case today. Through cosmic influences and through an upset of the Earth, the North Pole at that time shifted far to the west. The central point of the North Pole at that time is identical to present-day Florida in America. The polar regions at the time of Enoch were wondrous landscapes, filled with palms and other tropical vegetation. Similar conditions can still be found today in the former Hyperborea, so in Florida.
That is fantastic. But can you tell me exactly where at the North Pole this Hyperborea lay?
It lay exactly where the land is still called Greenland today, whereby the actual North Pole of that time is not identical with today's North Pole.
So Greenland, as far as I know, this means grassland in the German language.
That is so. Tir Nan Og lay there.
What is that?
Greenland and Land of Youth. But at that time, it was today's Florida.
So then Heracles, Gilgamesh, Enoch, Emmanuel, Amitabha, Methuselah, and Noah and all others were up there and not in Florida?
In Hyperborea, in Florida, when it was still at the spot where today the land still means grassland. But Emmanuel was not there because he was already in Florida, where it is to be found today.
Contact Report 041. And note, this contact report contains a drawing of Emmanuel.
All the pictures made so far are purely idiotic, because they do not have the slightest resemblance to his real physiognomy. The artists of the 2 millennia have created a fabulous fantasy picture of him that is devoid of any reality. They probably assumed that their drawings of his face would embody a certain spirituality, just as the misguided Earth human beings imagine a spiritualized man. And to nail the final blow, they then paint a halo around the pictures.
Don't the Earth humans know that the halo is only a fantasy product of some fantasists?
They believe so firmly in its authenticity, like that the dear God is eternity itself, and Satan is indeed a devil who roasts humans.
That is bad and incomprehensible.
Contact Report 045.
Jesus is the false name for Emmanuel, who already in his lifetime refused this name because he knew the future and knew what would be made of him. Jesus is the value of Antilogos, which, however, the Christian Church falsified into the Antichrist, which is why the true teachings of Emmanuel were falsified beyond recognition.
Contact Report 057.
As you know, I possess from the tomb of Emmanuel, alias Jesus Christ, a kind of flicker or mica. It looks like a transparent, multi-layered film. This material has now been analytically investigated by microscope at the Max Planck Institute for Scanning Electron Microscopy in Munich. The result is just as literal as I wrote it down here. Apart from sulfur and CO, O2 and H2O are also detectable. In my opinion, it is a crystalline substance of calcium sulfate, i.e., gypsum. This does not exist here. The remaining sample is still examined organically, then you can get a better picture. The material is flammable. It burns odorlessly to a white powder. What I am interested in now is this. Do you know where this calcium sulfate comes from, or whatever it may be, and which does not occur in this form in our country? Do you have any idea?
You are talking about the glass-like natural material that was in Emmanuel's burial cave?
Exactly, that is what I am talking about.
It was a gift from Gabriel the guardian protector, to his son Emmanuel, whose foster father was Joseph. The gift was given to Emmanuel at the age of 7, when his father Gabriel declared that it was a gift for the purpose of constant connection. This material served Emmanuel as a capacitor. His father Gabriel brought it here from Alcyon.
Contact Report 070.
Respecting and following the advice of the High Council, he Plejos prepared for the long-yearned-for return to the homeworlds, which took place 1,994 years ago, by your chronology, after Emmanuel, at Plejos's direction, begat by the spiritual leader Gabriel, was educated as a prophet and had become right for his mission.
Contact Report 150.
Emmanuel's disciple Judas Iscariot was made out to be a traitor to this day, while the true traitor, the high priest's son Judah Iharioth, is not even mentioned in the lying chronicles, so that the true traitor should be innocent of the murder of Emmanuel.
Thereby it is still to be noted by you, as I must explain, that all now following data are calculated according to usual earthly pre- and post-Emmanuel time reckoning. Year A.D. plus 32, Crucifixion of Emmanuel, accompanied by an unusual solar eclipse produced by a tremendous sandstorm. At the same time, a very strong earthquake occurred in Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia, which occurred with several earth tremors during the crucifixion.
Contact Report 200.
Thus, Pope Pius IX, among others, absurdly maintained and made the doctrine that Joseph's wife Mary, already from the moment of Emmanuel's conception, carried a rational soul in herself, and that already at conception the fertilized egg was animated by the soul, and so Emmanuel's personality and his reason had already existed.
Contact Report 207.
Then another question. In the New Testament of the Christian religion, there is talk in the Sermon on the Mount that Emmanuel should have fed 5,000 human beings, namely through the increase of fish and bread. To my knowledge, that is not true, because in this connection, the storage banks only speak of just 250 human beings who participated in the so-called Sermon on the Mount. Also, these were not just men, as it is said in the New Testament, like among other things in John chapter 6 and verse 1. Rather, they were mostly women and children who followed Emmanuel up the mountain, whereby the mountain was truly more of a hill. Thus, the 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, which Emmanuel increased by his powers of consciousness, were not provided for 5,000 human beings, but rather only for 250 human beings, respectively women and children, among whom there were only 40 men. Now, my question is this. When was the falsification made in relation to the alleged 5,000 persons?
That happened through John, as well as through the other disciples.
So it was still in Emmanuel's lifetime.
Yes, he lived at that time when the falsifications were made, already in India, where he also married and fathered several children with his wife. The falsifications originated from exaggerations.
Then one more question. Initially, it was only Judas Iscariot who could read and write. But to my knowledge, he also instructed all the other disciples in this art, which was not very popular at that time.
That is of correctness. Besides Judas Iscariot, all the other disciples were illiterates, who learned partially how to read in a short time by Judas, but not how to write.
Contact Report 210.
Luke was the author of the Gospel which bears the same name, as well as of the Acts of the Apostles, which, to my knowledge, he wrote during the period from AD 97 to 106, namely only according to hearsay, and in accordance with his own interpretations, which naturally led to falsifications, etc.
Your words correspond to what our scientists and all historians also explain.
Contact Report 212.
I concerned myself in detail around the clarification of your question regarding the authenticity of the biblical books. In this regard, I also asked our historians and worked through all the historical records that were placed at my disposal. It became entirely perceptible that all the biblical books were not written in a single instance by those persons to whom they are ascribed. So it is also incorrect that the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles come from Luke, and furthermore, the book of Job was not written by this man himself. Both books of the Bible are based on what was written down at a later time, as well as various books of the New Testament. Moreover, the letters that are listed in the New Testament also were not written by those to whom they are assigned. In truth, these were illiterates, who let their scribes write the letters, to whom they had to pay remunerations. Thus, one who was dictating a letter also could not control what the scribe wrote down, whereby it escaped the one dictating that very many things were falsified. This also applies to the fantastic stories that surround Paul, who, in his consciousness confusion, saw himself as a martyr and, thus, also lived and worked accordingly, and following this, he then ultimately died by assassins, as this also happened with Moses, who made many enemies within his own ranks, who then robbed him of his life.
So it actually is not like what I said on the 11th of June, when I thought that Luke was the writer of the Gospel of Luke and of the Acts of the Apostles. Yes, Sfath already said that Luke could neither write nor read, as this should have also been true of the others who are praised as Bible and New Testament writers. But what about the Gospel of Matthew? Were you also able to clarify this?
I was also able to do that, yes. Matthew was just as ignorant of reading and writing as all the others, to whom the Gospels and the books of the Bible are attributed. The Gospel of Matthew was dictated by Matthew to a scribe named Joshua, who interpreted the whole thing in his free discretion and wrote it down and consequently also falsified it.
Does one know the reason, then, why all the books and letters are, nevertheless, attributed to the disciples and evangelists and prophets?
It should be noted that out of Emmanuel's disciples, only Judas Iscariot was actually acquainted with reading and writing, for he was, which no one knew and therefore which also was not handed down, a scribe who left his profession, however, and became a follower of Emmanuel. As a result of many years of investigations, which were also carried out by our scientists and historians through time travels, it is to be explained that already during the outset of the origin of Christianity, the disciples and evangelists were anxious to give the impression that they were experts of reading and writing, and thus more highly educated than the common people. This was because the simple persons among the people were of the erroneous view that those who were more highly educated than others would just know and understand more, and, consequently, would also be enabled and authorized to teach the more unknowing and uneducated people. An erroneous evil that has survived on the earth to the current day among all nations of the earth, which is also why the humans of today's time are still of this misconception. Through this, like at that time, the humans are title-believing and office-believing, and they let themselves be suppressed, exploited, or just held down by those who have a rank and a reputation and who occupy an office. So even today, it is likewise as in the time of Emmanuel and of the old prophets. And precisely of these, it remains to be said that not one of them has written down his offered teachings or his history. Indeed, this was done by others, even the scribes, who were instructed to do so. The first Torah originated from this, but it was later destroyed up to the last letter by a major fire, and consequently there were no more written records, and everything was just handed down by word of mouth over generations. Needless to say, the consequence of this was that enormously many falsifications arose, until one day 12 self-proclaimed prophets, out of their own grace, gathered a large number of scribes around themselves and went out with these into an outlying area, where they lived for 40 days in austere form and, during this time, wrote down 240 books, from which then, over time, the new Torah emerged, from which then also the Bible of Christianity emerged, to which the New Testament was then simply added.
But in addition, it must be said, so that no misunderstandings arise, that on the one hand, every one of the so-called prophets told his scribe those things and stories in the manner he had received them from the various sources. Also, it must be made clear that the so-called books cannot be compared to today's books, which often contain several hundred pages. Most of the books of the self-proclaimed prophets, their writing experts, and thus their scribes, only contained a few pages, apart from the books of Moses and some others. But of these books, the majority vanished again. Consequently, today, to my knowledge, only 33 of these are available in the Bible. As I have learned, in the Old Testament scriptures, one will first notice Moses, Joshua and Judges, Ruth and 2 of Samuel, 2 of Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, with Esther, these as history books. Then, as poetic books, there are Job, Psalms, then the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. These are followed by the prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, then Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, followed by Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, along with Haggai, Zechariah, and finally Malachi.
Contact Report 213.
And as I could learn from Emmanuel, when I asked him about it, the story of the carpenter's son is not correct, for his foster father, Joseph, had not been a simple carpenter but rather the owner of a small carpentry business, with various workers who fulfilled his orders for him. Joseph had already learned the craft as a carpenter from the ground up with his father, who had already originally placed a ship carpentry business on the legs. Thus, Joseph and Mary, as well as Emmanuel and his brothers and sisters, had not been simple folk from the common people, but according to Emmanuel, they would have enjoyed a degree of prosperity, which also allowed for it that Father Joseph and Mother Mary, as well as all children, could learn to read and write. Thus, Joseph was an independent craftsman with his own business, so to speak, and just as independent were also Emmanuel's brothers, who pursued their own crafts. And as Emmanuel said, he, too, was very independent and autonomous, was an expert of reading and writing, and earned his living through the spreading of the spiritual teaching, aka creation energy teaching, for which he received donations, which he did not administer to himself, however. Rather, he let these be administered by one of his disciples.
Those are issues that are familiar to me.
Aha. Then you should also know that it was in no wise the Jewish people who bore the guilt for the fact that Emmanuel was sentenced to death by the cross. In fact, it was such that the Roman garrison ruled in Jerusalem at that time, and its laws possessed validity. Only the Jewish scribes and the Jewish leaders were actually guilty of the fact that Emmanuel was sentenced to death, although a huge misunderstanding also contributed to this when Emmanuel was asked the question as to whether the accusation was correct. When he said, "You said it," he did not mean that the alleged accusation was true, but the meaning of his words was that he meant that the questioner said it. And it was precisely this misunderstanding that was the deciding factor for the guilty sentencing. The scribes and the rulers, however, who fought vehemently against Emmanuel's teaching, were true Jews, and they were the actual ones who strove to eliminate Emmanuel, and to be sure, finally and for all time, through an execution. At the same time, the Jewish people themselves had nothing to say here because they were forbidden to interfere in any imponderable court matters, etc. Nevertheless, as spectators, the people as a rule were allowed to do so, but as I said, they would not have had any authority for a verdict. But as always, it was also the case with those who were authorized that under them there was a certain percentage of the mob that was strongly greased with pieces of silver from the Jewish scribes and elders, as well as from the synagogue bigshots, etc., in order to cry out for the death penalty when those who were responsible for sentencing, and thus not the Jewish people, were asked for the verdict. Thus, it was the paid-up and fired-up mob that cried out for crucifixion. Therefore, the Jewish people bore absolutely no guilt for this. In fact, it was also the case that the actual process was carried out by the Jewish elders, priests, scribes, and other public officials, with the chief priests possessing great power. They were, indeed, the main ones who wanted to dissuade Emmanuel from his mission efforts, and, as I said, by all of their available means. But all of these who were responsible cannot be regarded as Jewish people, who, in many respects, were actually and truly more on Emmanuel's side than on the side of the chief priests, elders, scribes, and other public officials, for under these, very many of the Jews suffered. But the fact that the blame for Emmanuel's crucifixion is placed upon them is based on deliberately false political, theological, and thus religious accusations, which should serve the purpose, and which had the intention, of denigrating the Jews and lifting up Christianity high into the sky. And precisely from this arose the hatred of the Jews, to which millions of Jews and Jewish friends fell victim in the Second World War, through the inhumane and degrading madness of the final solution. What is still to be said concerning the trial before Pilate probably needs no great explanation, for the whole thing was just a formality in order to satisfy the Roman justice and law. But what is to be said in relation to the first trial by the Jewish officials, who partly consisted of high priests, scribes, and elders who influenced the rest? It was, indeed, the case that it was an effective process, even though this has long been challenged by various sides. Sfath taught me all this.
You are very detailed, and everything is completely accurate.
Now, in this whole connection, only Emmanuel's journey to Kashmir in India is missing, and his work there, as well as his death at the age of about 115 years, and his burial. It is repeatedly asserted that this does not correspond to the truth, and that Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian, the founder of the Islamic sect Ahmadiyya, had told fibs with the story that he had discovered Emmanuel's grave in Srinagar, India. As Sfath already explained to me, this corresponds at least to a form of reality because the founder of the sect was not actually the discoverer of the tomb. Rather, a man named Kanishka Rashtrakuta found the tomb in the year AD 746. All this is vehemently denied, however, by all sorts of scientists and wannabe scientists, as well as by would-be know-it-alls.
That will also continue to remain so, for know-it-alls and wrong scientists, etc. never die out. Nevertheless, what Sfath explained to you undoubtedly corresponds to the truth because we have clarified these issues very precisely, and thus, There is no doubt that Emmanuel had worked in India, was also married there, and fathered several children, of which a son went to Jerusalem during his older years and hid Judas Iscariot's scrolls in Emmanuel's tomb, where you then found them in 1964 when Isa Rashid led you there.
As you know, I have gathered and calculated a lot with regard to the Christian calendar. You have also told me that I had calculated very precisely, and that only small errors were contained in my calculations. With respect to these calculations, I have endeavored again and recently discovered that the actual birth of Emmanuel must have taken place not 4, 6, or even 7 years before the Christian calendar, but rather 5 years. This means that Emmanuel effectively must have seen the light of this world 5 years before the Christian calendar. Through a look into the past, I also discovered that at the time of his birth, not only was a beaming spaceship visible in the sky, but also actually a very large comet, which could be seen all over the world, namely for about several weeks.
Your explanations are correct. And since you alone have now found the true facts, nothing more stands in the way for me to tell you further details. The exact year of Emmanuel's birth was 5 years before the Christian calendar known today. At that time, there actually was a very large and unusually strongly radiating comet that was observable from the Earth, which we call the Fruitful One, because from very early times, inseminations for the Earth and for the planet Phaeton, respectively Melona, have gone out from it, whereby life could develop on these two Sol satellites. The Fruitful One, however, has an extremely long period of revolution on a path that leads far out into the Oort cloud. Accordingly, it will take more than 11,000 years, according to Earth's measure of time, before a return of this comet occurs in the SOL system. Its orbital period is 13,200 years. Together with this event of the appearance of the Fruitful One, the birth of Emmanuel also took place on the 3rd of February, 5 years before the Christian calendar, whereby the 3rd of February of today's calendar is converted for the time and the day of that time. At that same time, when Emmanuel was born, in order to monitor and supervise everything, a large Plejaren beam ship was stationed high in the atmosphere over Bethlehem. This radiated very brightly, for it was one of those aircraft that collect energy from the atmosphere, which light up, radiating very strongly, when they penetrate into the area of the processing system through which anti-gravity is produced.
Contact Report 214.
Did Luke ever make a portrait of Emmanuel? To my knowledge, such is attributed to him.
That does not correspond to the truth. In no wise did Luke master the art of drawing, consequently he was also in no position to produce a portrait of Emmanuel. Such a portrait of Emmanuel, which is attributed to him, comes from an artist of Italian origin, who never saw Emmanuel and who also had no description with respect to Emmanuel's appearance. His name was Alfonso Stranieri.
But now, tell me what social status Simon Peter had. I mean the disciple of Emmanuel?
He was of the propertied class, and therefore very rich. It was he who constantly donated from his own wealth for the implementation of the mission and for the spreading of Emmanuel's teaching. If this would not have been so, then everyone would have had to live a more frugal life than what was, in fact, the case. While there were other wealthy ones among the disciples who also contributed their part to everything, it was Simon Peter, however, who was the main donor.
And Matthew, the tax collector?
He was also quite wealthy.
Contact Report 216.
In the story of Emmanuel, it is recorded that he had succumbed to sweating blood before being arrested by his captors. To my knowledge, this is called hematitosis. Many humans, who are not educated in relation to this, suppose that sweating blood is not possible. But to my knowledge, this acceptance is erroneous.
That is of correctness. Hematidrosis, or sweating blood, is a reality.
Contact Report 218.
There is still much more to say, namely that, by and large, the Earth humans are not actually interested in the effective truth, but only in unreal things and lies of religions, sects, swindlers, liars, and cheats who lie their heads off, hypocritically preaching doctrines of salvation and plans of salvation, and giving just as deceitful promises of salvation, which can never be fulfilled. And the Earth humans fall for this, because to them, in their falsehood and in their ignorance, in which they eke out their existence and search for a better life and for the real truth, there is a real need for salvation. And the rule is that through the deception of the religions and sects, the people rely on the false story of divine salvation and on the divine plan of salvation. Through this, with unintentional gavolt, they push every responsibility far away from themselves, relying on the message of salvation and, therewith, on the redemption, which will never become a reality, by God or by his hosts of angels, by Jesus Christ, by saints or even by those who are deceased, who should bring help from the beyond, or by extraterrestrials, as this has been preached and has been maintained for quite some time by irresponsible and exploitative UFO sect gurus, who will support themselves as such in the future, as Svath explained, through which all of the chiefs of the sects become very rich, for they financially exploit their followers and believers, as well as those who are enslaved to them and other fools, and through this, they live in joy and glory. The Earth humans do not run to the truth but to lies and deception, to religions and sects, and they believe everything that they are led to believe, and everything that is given to them by the sect bosses and religious bigwigs. With this, I in no wise want to attack those religionists, that is to say those parishioners, priests, monks, devotees, and other religious representatives who are devoted to their faith in honesty and who maintain love, peace, freedom, harmony, humanity, and true brotherly love, etc. in the best form. In fact, I know many such human beings, and their lifestyle leaves nothing to be desired in the aforementioned forms. Therefore, I give them all necessary respect and due reverence, even though they are connected to a religious faith. But those whom I attack are all those who cannot be added to these worthy people because they are among the severe or most severe fallible ones who, in their Ausartung to get very badly out of control of the good human nature, give no honor to the designation of human being, having parasite-like, mendacious, swindler-like, and deceitful thoughts, feelings, emotions, and manners of acting. And through these, they deeply and disgustingly alienate and dissociate themselves from the designation of honorable human being.
Contact Report 223.
Do you know to what religious persuasion Emmanuel's parents Mary and Joseph belonged, what this was, and from where the two actually came? Were they actually Nazarenes?
To answer the first part of your question, Mary and Joseph did not belong to any religious persuasion. They were natives of Tiberias, a place located at the Sea of Galilee at that time. Mary was the daughter of a merchant family from Tiberias, and Joseph was the son of a shipbuilder and carpenter's family, which was also located in Tiberias. And if you still want to have information about the two families, then I can say that Mary had 3 brothers and 4 sisters, and Joseph had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. At the time of Emmanuel's birth, all siblings and parents of Mary and Joseph were still alive. What is still to be said, but which should also be well known to you. Joseph was not the biological father, but rather the foster father of Emmanuel. The biological father was the extraterrestrial Gabriel.
Contact Report 224.
We already talked about the fact that the so-called books of the New Testament, which actually only represent articles or the like, were not written in a single instance by all those to whom they are attributed. Among all the disciples, only Judas Iscariot was knowledgeable of reading and writing, in addition to Emmanuel himself, who was not a disciple, but was rather the teacher. All the letters, etc. of the disciples were, in fact, written by women and men, and indeed on behalf of the disciples. For at that time it was not the case that many were experts of writing and reading. There were only the scribes and a few others who learned to write and read because there were no special schools, as these are now available everywhere all over the world, and children are obligated to attend them in most countries. But while the Bible and the attached New Testament give the impression that a large part of the people in Emmanuel's time would have been able to read and write, this actually does not correspond to the truth. However, because the vast majority of the human beings at that time, including the disciples, with the exception of Judas Iscariot and Emmanuel, was ignorant of reading and writing. Only special prophets, rulers, and their subordinates in special offices were able to read and write. Thus, it was very rare that ordinary citizens could learn to read and write. And while we are at it, the Bible is an invented Jewish chronicle, which very well holds certain truths in itself, but, on the whole, is fictitious and was written together by 12 of the book-knowledgeable men who called themselves prophets and who, in 40 days, wrote 240 books or stories that were based on ancient oral acceptances, assertions, and traditions and deliberate distortions, from which arose then the second holy book, the Torah number 2, that is to say the 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch of Judaism. The first Torah had been destroyed in a devastating fire, after which then, more than 400 years later, the second Torah was written by the 12 alleged prophets, as said. Thus, the Bible has nothing to do with true history books or with true textbooks, and is in no way connected with the Testament. In truth, it mostly concerns fantasized together fables without any value, which were then stolen in their entirety by Christianity, in the last consequence, and reshaped for itself. Thus, Christianity itself has also created an alleged chronicle and a past, which are actually designed solely for Judaism, and have nothing at all to do with Christianity. Emmanuel also wanted nothing to do with this chronicle, for he did not teach their nonsense but rather the teaching of the Spirit, as he had received it from the lineage of Enoch. And what is still to be said, it really was so, that in Emmanuel's time, as I said, out of all the disciples, only Judas Iscariot was knowledgeable of reading and writing, while the others were illiterates. This also applies to the 7 disciples who belonged to the group, but of whom no records exist from Judas Iscariot, as well as not of the various other women and men who were on the move with Emmanuel during the time of his spreading of the teaching. At the same time, I also wonder whether it will one day become known that Emmanuel's disciples only went with him occasionally because they repeatedly had to perform their work and business, etc. at home, about which Judas Iscariot also wrote nothing, and thus the impression is given that the disciples had always been with and around Emmanuel. Furthermore, everything written by Judas is only a brief outline of the entire life, teaching, and work of Emmanuel, for in fact, this one was not just on the move and spreading the teaching for only 3 years or so, as is maintained by Christianity. Rather, he was already active in this form starting from his 6th year of age, and thus for a total of almost 29 years when he was beaten to the cross at the age of a little more than 34 years.
Contact Report 238.
The Pharisee Simeon, the father of the traitor Judah Iscariot.
Contact Report 244.
What was the name of the god with whom Emmanuel worked, and where did these 3 Jeshwish come from?
Emmanuel finally worked together with Jeshwish Calaton, who came from Era.
Contact Report 248.
The Bible lies and twists the facts that happened at that time. As I know the facts, all of the prophetic books and other contents of the Bible were falsified beyond recognition, whereby the prophets themselves as well as their deeds and their activities were represented completely incorrectly, which gave the impression, which has remained preserved in Christianity up to the present day, that these prophets would have killed and murdered. But this corresponds to no iota of truth.
Contact Report 257.
Again and again the question arises whether Peter really was the first pope. I know that you have already informed me about this at an earlier time and explained that Peter never held the papal office. This statement of yours, however, has never been recorded in writing, which is why I am now once again officially asking you for the answer.
It has its correctness with what you said. Peter never held the office of Pope.
And what is it about the Vatican's claim that Peter's skeletal remains were found in the Vatican or something?
This assertion corresponds to a deliberately created lie because the mortal remains of Peter were then cremated by delusional Christian enemies because they were of the belief that he could return. The matter with the found skeletal remains can be clarified by the fact that they belonged to a man who was a church servant during his lifetime, who had to maintain the church buildings and ensure order.
Contact Report 334.
Didn't Florina ask you to give me an enlightening answer regarding an old bones urn that was reported in all public media in October 2002, which is supposed to be an urn containing the bones of James, the son of Joseph, brother of Jesus? This is actually nonsense, for Emmanuel had his brother James brought to Srinagar, where he died and was buried at the age of 93. While Emmanuel did not die on Golgotha, but also in Srinagar, Kashmir, and that at the age of.
Florina actually commissioned me with your question, which I passed on to Quetzal, since he is the authoritative luminary on the life and history of Emmanuel and his siblings. According to his instructions, I am to tell you that an urn with James's bones never existed and therefore could not be found in Jerusalem or anywhere else in Israel or Palestine, etc. The bones urn that you mention, as our research has clarified, is a forgery, in the sense that it is declared as James's urn, which has nothing to do with the bones of James, Emmanuel's brother, for he actually died in Srinagar, as did Emmanuel, who was buried in Srinagar in 115, according to his correct birth time. According to the so-called Christian calendar, this applies to the year 111.
Emmanuel was never called Jesus, as his disciples accused him after his departure. And besides, in his time the names James, Joseph, and Jesus were very common, so that James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, which should be written on the urn, will apply to another James, Joseph, and Jesus. Just like today, there were several ways that the three names could appear in a family at the same time.
Your question to Florina in this regard, which I also put to Quetzal, corresponds to the real thing. In Emmanuel's time, Quetzal explained, the names as they are called must have appeared 34 times as son, father, and brother. But the said bone urn is a fake.
Contact Report 377.
For more than 2,000 years, you have been the only person on planet Earth who has been able to make such space journeys and visit planets and moons of the SOL system, as well as alien systems and galaxies. Emmanuel was the last person who was born on Earth to be able to make such journeys into space, and this was made possible by my great-grandfather Gabriel.
What do you think about the matter of sulfur? Why should it be dangerous for me? And your great-grandfather Gabriel was, of course. Nowadays they spell the name with an A. What does the name mean again?
The Mighty One of Creation.
Contact Report 415.
There have been some television shows about Christian relics, for which I would like to know what is true about them. The first question relates to the legendary Grail, a vessel Joseph of Arimathea is said to have used to catch Emmanuel's blood at the crucifixion. This goblet is supposed to work wonders and make one immortal as well as heal all sicknesses and evils, etc.
This is absolute nonsense, for neither does such a grail exist, nor has Joseph of Arimathea caught the blood of Emmanuel in a vessel. That, however, no other human being has done either.
This senseless claim was invented fictitiously centuries after the event of the crucifixion, namely by members of a sect that emerged from Emmanuel's already early falsified teaching. And the fact that no blood of Emmanuel was caught in a vessel, rather that the little blood that Emmanuel lost dripped to the ground and seeped away, is perfectly certain, because this was recorded in our annals by the personality of that time, Gabriel, the procreating father of Emmanuel. He was direct eyewitness of the real event.
Interesting. I did not know that. Then the second question. Do you know the story regarding a holy lance that was said to have been used to stab Emmanuel in the loin on the cross?
Also, this nonsense is known to us. It is claimed that whoever possesses this lance, that is to say, the tip of the lance, should be imparted invincibility. The lance is supposed to have supernatural powers. According to the claim, a Roman soldier is said to have stabbed Emmanuel with this tip of the lance, which is why his blood is supposed to stick to it. This tip of the lance is also said to confer great power on the owner, which is why Hitler was also eager to get hold of the lance, as was the case with other rulers, despots, and dictators, among them also kings and emperors.
This tip of the lance is a forgery from the 8th century after Emmanuel. However, in truth, there are still further such forgeries, which were made in the course of the time. In 1354, Pope Innocent VI, who was in place from 1352 to 1362, declared the 8th century tip of the lance to be the Holy Lance, with the claim that it was indeed the lance with which Emmanuel was stabbed in the loin. Truthfully, the forgery is a piece made from a lance used in combat actions, which, however, was not yet hand-forged at the time of Emmanuel. Consequently, he could also have never been touched by it.
That too was said in the television program. Okay, then still the question about the shroud, the so-called Shroud of Turin, which is claimed to be a shroud that carries the image of Emmanuel, alias Jesus. However, about this you once told me that it would be an image of an Italian merchant.
That is correct, because the shroud does not show the image of Emmanuel, but that of a merchant from Turin, Italy, called Caesar Canova. The shroud was made by the brother of the deceased, Luciano Canova, an alchemist. The process took place on 7th June 1324 and lasted until 10th June, that is to say, 4 days. During this, the procedure was not such that the shroud was placed on the deceased and the latter was rubbed with chemicals, as is often claimed, but it was a very early form of photography, whereby the corpse was placed vertically in front of a large glass lens, through which the image was then projected for 4 days, through an effect of sunlight onto a large fabric surface soaked in chemicals in a dark room, after which the shroud was then treated with silver nitrate, and the image became in that way visible and retained.
Contact Report 437.
And do you know what blood group Emmanuel had?
Indeed, we know that. It was blood group 0 negative.
Contact Report 439.
In the Christian world, Emmanuel and the so-called saints are always depicted with a halo hanging over their heads. Do you know where this naughtiness comes from? Because neither Emmanuel nor any other prophet had such a gloriole over his head. Even an aureole, with which the whole figure is surrounded in a circle, as well as the almond-shaped mandorla, I cannot associate with Emmanuel, Mary, and various saints. I only know the whole thing from India and the Far East, where the gods and saints have been represented with such garlands of rays since ancient times.
From there, Christianity has also taken over the essence of the glorious beings in order to give their religious figures a supernatural appearance and to make the believers self-conscious. The garland of lights around a religious figure is to testify to its holiness and spiritual greatness, as well as its heavenly origin and its sublimity above all earthly things.
Fundamental to the anti-Semitism that emanates from the Christian world and relates to the Jews, many Christians hold them responsible for the crucifixion of Emmanuel, alias Jesus Christ. For this reason alone, they have been stirring up hatred against Judaism since time immemorial. But this is absolutely nonsensical. In truth, Emmanuel was not crucified by the Jews, but through the fault of the chief priests and the Romans, who stirred up the people, after which the crucifixion was carried out by the Roman henchmen. Thus, the actual Jewish people did not contribute anything to the crucifixion, for the pro and hurricane cries of the people, which were under the suggestive influence of the high priests, were only their few, who, moreover, in no way embodied the people. So, in principle, the whole Jewish people cannot be discriminated against and pronounced guilty of the crucifixion of Emmanuel, as has been done since time immemorial, the Catholic Church bearing the main blame for this lie, for it was the Catholic Church that brought this slander of the alleged guilt of the Jews into the world. The truth is also that the Romans saw Emmanuel's teaching as revolutionary, and for this reason alone they intended to condemn him and hand him over to crucifixion, which they did with the help of the Jewish high priests. Well, the history of the origin of the people of Israel leads far back to the Hebraeans and the ancient Hebrews who came out of them, who were not exactly saints as a whole, and who conquered Palestine out of it with evil acts of war and murder. But this is already thousands of years ago, and has nothing to do with the crucifixion of Emmanuel, which was unjust in one way or another, and which, as I said, was not to be attributed to the Jewish people, but to their high priests and the Romans. Like all true prophets, who brought the teaching of the Spirit, or the teaching of truth, or the teaching of life to the respective people, Emmanuel was also a revolutionary, who of course was not appreciated either by the Romans or by the chief priests. Emmanuel's teaching was the teaching of peace, freedom, love, and harmony, as well as the carrying of one's own responsibility, leaving out religion. This, of course, did not suit either the chief priests or the Romans in their dirty business, so that the revoluter and blasphemer they hated had to disappear from the scene, which was to happen by crucifixion. At least that was what they hoped, but they did not expect that Emmanuel was only in deep faint when he was taken down from the cross so that he could flee to Syria and later to India. Many Jewish believers who had taken pleasure in his teaching helped him in this, and there were many of them.
Contact Report 445.
The Christian religion in particular plays the most decisive role, in which the hatred of Jews was fundamentally born, and that from the crucifixion of Christ, which was taken as a reason for hatred against the Jews and for their persecution at an early stage. But the fact that the henchmen who arrested Emmanuel alias Jesus Christ, in his time were just as much Romans and so-called idolaters, see Roman mythology, as the author of the death sentence, Pontius Pilate, is deliberately overlooked, as is the fact that the executioners were also of Roman blood. At that time the Jews were under Roman thumb and had to do and let do what they were told. This also applied to the Jewish scribes and to the Pharisees, etc., for they all had to dance to the Roman violin, which was played by the occupiers and rulers of the country and the people. Although at that time the scribes and priests of the Jewish faith deliberately had their fingers in the crucifixion of Emmanuel, because he raged against their erroneous teachings, that is, the Romans came to them just in time to accuse Emmanuel of revolt, but basically the Romans were the real culprits, because through them Emmanuel was crucified, after the scribes and priests had incited the rabble to demand the death sentence by incitement. Consequently, it should be clear that it was not the Jews who were really responsible for the crucifixion of Emmanuel alias Christ, but the Romans.
Contact Report 453 Quetzal. Former personality equals Gabriel, father of Emmanuel. Contact Report 499.
Helak was not my great-grandfather, but my great-great-grandfather. According to the earthly calendar, he became 1,163 years old and died in the year 98 before the Christian calendar. His old age was and is as extraordinary for us as it is for Earth humans, when a human being reaches an age of about 125 or 130 years, which is also very rare. He was my great-grandfather on my father's side, and he sired my great-grandfather Gabriel even at an advanced age. He also reached an extraordinary age of 402 years. Great-grandfather Gabriel then begat on earth with Maria Emmanuel, which is familiar to you. He also begat Ezekiel, my grandfather, one of whose sons was my father's Foth.
Contact Report 503.
I would like to tell you what I have found out about the family tree of the Meier von Bulach and also about you. As we have both already suspected, the line goes back to Emmanuel and finally to the Son of Heaven Semjasa. For my research, I have to admit, however, that these are only to be understood in very rough outlines and in the main and decisive points concerning the family tree, because to research and list the complete family tree would be much too costly. But what has emerged from my further research into the family tree is that before the Major of Amalfi, by whom the Hospitaller Brotherhood was founded in Jerusalem in 1048, the family tree line goes back to a man named Dyson, who was active in Israel as a Maggid, respectively, as a wandering herald about 180 years after Emmanuel. His male descendant, Jeshua, moved to Syria, after whose death his two male descendants moved to Medina and founded a family there. In one family 4 daughters were born, in the other 2 sons and 1 daughter. One of the sons died very young, however, while the other emigrated to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, married there, and, due to the harassment of the population, took the name of his Arab wife. This marriage produced 3 daughters, but also a son who emigrated back to Israel. There, he gave up the name he had taken in Mecca and called himself Major, from whose line the merchant Major from Amalfi finally emerged. Dison was a descendant of Emmanuel's son Joseph, who was born in India, but after his father's death went to Jerusalem and founded a family there, from which 2 daughters and Dison as the only son emerged. His pedigree, in turn, logically led back to Emmanuel and to Joseph, Emmanuel's foster father and his ancestral family tree, whereby, as is well known, Emmanuel's procreation father was the Son of Heaven, Gabriel, whose genetic structure was naturally transferred to Emmanuel and passed on. Emmanuel's spirit form, which originated from the Nocodemian line, naturally revived all the old prophets of the same line in their time, but also Semjasa, the father of Adam, who was a cousin of the ringleader Semjasa, the leader of the sons of heaven.
Contact Report 504.
17 disciples belonged to Emmanuel, as well as his mother and Mary Magdalene, who was his friend. The father of the traitor Judas Ihariath, the Pharisee Simeon Ihariath, had written a diatribe in the name of Judas Ishkarioth, accusing him and Emmanuel that they themselves had caused the betrayal. The same Pharisee Simeon Ihariath, together with a scribe, had also written a false gospel in the name of Judas Ishkarioth.
Contact Report 506. A note: this contact report contains a drawing 3 variations of Judas Iscariot. Contact Report 545.
Emmanuel, for example, means the one with divine knowledge. So I understand that divine knowledge is not the knowledge of a mythical creature, a god, but an Jishwish knowledge.
Contact Report 555.
As a result, the bonds and connections that had been formed over a long period of time were also lost, but only on the basis of the new sectarian Christian faith, which was first combined with the cult of Natalis Solis, the god of the sun, whose feast day was celebrated on the 25th of December, and which Christians secretly adopted as the Feast of Christ, respectively as the Feast of the Birth of Christ. From the year 339 onwards, Christians officially began to celebrate the alleged birth of Christ more and more officially at the same time as the Natalis Solis festival, because this cult continued to exist for a long time, although this festival of Christ had been secretly practiced for around 30 years. Constantine also belonged to these Christ festivities, for he had already fallen prey to the Christian faith. In 309, although he was at the same time a follower of the Natalis Solis cult and believed that he would be able to consolidate his power more easily if he was dependent on the gods of both cults.
Contact Report 568.
The ritual of circumcision in relation to male newborns was largely replaced by baptism in Christianity. In 1962, the Second Vatican Council abolished completely the Feast of Circumcision of the Lord and Circumcisione Domini, commemorating the alleged circumcision of Jesus on the 8th day after Christmas Eve, or the 1st of January LK. 221 EU. The fact is that the story of this circumcision was a pure fairy tale of Jewish Christianity, because Emmanuel alias Jesus was not circumcised.
Contact Report 576.
The values that Emmanuel supposedly called Jesus Christ taught, that is to say mercy, peaceableness, justice, helpfulness, charity, and gentleness, which is the right thing to do since Emmanuel really did teach these virtues.
Contact Report 600.
The dove is mentioned in the Bible even more times, but as a rule without an oil leaf or olive branch, for example, at Emmanuel's baptism.
Contact Report 602.
By the way, the ancient myrrh has also been known since ancient times. Myrrh is the resin of 2 or 3 species of the balsam tree and can prevent infections by viruses and fungi. Myrrh also played a role in the birth of Emmanuel, in which 4 wise men, who came from afar, brought precious resins and oils for him. One of the 4 wise men was an educated physician, whatever that may have been at that time, who brought along a tree resin, the preservative benzoin resin, as well as the medically relevant sandarac or resin of the cypress tree, the scent of which has a strong effect on the vegetative nervous system. Benzoin is a traditional medicine used as an antiseptic, being used, for example, from Java to India for colds, coughs, and sore throats, but also as a medicine for urinary tract infections.
Contact Report 609.
But as ever, the truthful Prophet Muhammad never had time to write down his teachings and his warnings and prophecies personally, so he instructed his cousin to do it, but he interpreted everything wrongly at his own discretion and wrote it down in such a falsified way that Muhammad's teaching came to even worse shame than it had done about 500 years before with Emmanuel's teaching through his brother James and through Paulus Solus and the disciples Luke, Matthew, Mark, and John.
Contact Report 658.
As a result of the inability of people at Emmanuel's time wrongly called Jesus Christ to understand many concepts, such as consciousness, the traditional and widespread term spirit was used, which has survived to this day and creates a tremendous misunderstanding and confusion. Emmanuel was aware that the term spirit did not correspond to correctness, but due to the incomprehension of the people of that time, he could not use the correct term consciousness. So he had no choice but to use the term spirit to explain the values of the teaching of the prophets, or the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life and the meaning and value of the prayers. And since the term spirit was understood by people at that time as that and is still understood today, what happens and is done through consciousness? That thoughts are cultivated, actions and ideas are conceived and carried out, inventions are made, poems are rhymed and written, works are conceived and created, etc. So it resulted with the word spirit, that it was understood what just had to be understood.
Contact Report 662.
The effective beginnings of racism were already set in Galilee and Judea by the very first Christians respectively, the followers and disciples of Emmanuel of Nazareth, who is falsely insulted by the Christian world as Jesus Christ, and thus with a name which he neither received at his birth nor later carried, because he was simply ascribed to him by his followers and disciples for having to be Messiah. The hatred against the Jews began very early with the beginnings of Christianity, namely through the followers and disciples of the alleged Jesus Christ, who was never so thought of and called by his parents Mary and Joseph, but with the name Emmanuel, as the prophet Isaiah predicted in chapter 7, 10-17 in a prophecy. But in the Bible, in the so-called Old Testament, which in truth does not correspond to a testament, but to a chronicle that was drawn up and falsified centuries later, it is claimed to be a lie that Emmanuel was not called Emmanuel by his parents, but Jesus. So already in the early days through the Jesus followers and Jesus disciples and their lies, the falsification of the name from Emmanuel to Jesus arose. And because Emmanuel, through his teaching of the prophets, or teaching of the Spirit, or teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, revealed true beings to the offending elders, chief priests, Pharisees, and scribes, they put their henchmen on him and persecuted him. In principle, however, the Jewish people were not indifferent to the fact that those through whom they were to be taught the right laws and commandments lived contrary to their teachings and rejected the way of life of the people as wrong. And this happened because Emmanuel described the way of life of the elders, Pharisees and scribes, as degenerate, excessive, and misleading, who also called the teaching of the prophets a lie, which was declared by Emmanuel to be the truth of creation. The latter found many followers among the Jewish people, contrary to the false lives of the elders, chief priests, Pharisees, and scribes, who called together a number of like-minded people and testified by lies and slander against Emmanuel when he was arrested by the evildoers, brought to trial, and sentenced to death on the cross. So according to Plejaren records, it was not the Jewish people, but only the actual ringleaders or elders, high priests, Pharisees, and scribes, and the 42 like-minded who were responsible for the imprisonment, the false testimony, condemnation, and the crucifixion of Emmanuel. The rest of the Jewish people had nothing at all to do with it, but what the Jesus Christ inventors, or Jesus followers and Jesus disciples, full of hatred, deliberately and completely misrepresented, and it was subsequently slanderously passed down by the so-called Christian New Testament. To this hatred against the Jews also contributed the allegedly unadulterated first letter of Paul to the Thessalonians, which is reproduced by Martin Luther under Thessalonians 2:14, 2:16 Luther, Bible 1912. It is said to be one of the earliest preserved written documents of Christianity, although it is not mentioned that this letter was not written by Paul alias Saul, but by a scribe of the time. This precisely because Paul himself was just as ignorant of reading and writing as all the others who went with Emmanuel, except for the disciple Judas Iscarioth, who made written records and to whom the Talmud Jmmanuel leads back available at Figu, Hinter Schmidruti 1225, 8495 Schmidruti. Well, the first letter of Paul, which was written by a scribe according to Paul's instructions and interpreted by the letter writer at his own discretion. The effective truth according to the Plejaren states that the Jewish people themselves had nothing whatsoever to do with the persecution, condemnation, and crucifixion of Emmanuel, wrongly Jesus Christ, but only the elders, chief priests, Pharisees, and scribes of that time, as well as the 42 who were in bondage to them.
Contact Report 684.
The hilltop of Masada is formed by a plateau, and the plateau was originally accessible only by 3 narrow mule tracks, as it was protected on all sides by rocky escarpments. Essentially, the fortress was built on the site of a smaller fortress several decades older in 3 phases, within 10 years between 42 BC and 32 BC. The whole thing was commissioned by King Herod Thirst the Great, who was a Roman client king in Judea, Galilee, Samaria, and the neighboring areas. This Herod is best known for the infanticide in Bethlehem attributed to him in the Bible according to Matthew. He was born in Edom in 73 BC, after which he died in Jericho in 4 BC and was buried in Judea. His wife was Mariamne, to whom he was married from 37 BC to 29 BC. His children, Herod Antipas, Herod Archelaus, Herod Philippos, Herod Boethos, were also his successors. Herod I the Great was one of the most brutal and cruel regents of antiquity, and at the same time one of the greatest builders of his time, in the area of tension between Palestine and Rome. When he died, his funeral bier was made of pure gold, decorated with precious gems, and covered with fabrics embroidered in different colors, on which the corpse lay wrapped in a purple robe. On his head he wore a diadem and a golden crown, while his scepter was placed beside his right hand. The whole thing was a funeral of immense and rare pomp and pageantry. However, it was not until nearly 4 decades later that this event was reported by a born Jewish historian named Joseph ben Jathitjahu. This man came from a Jewish priestly family, but after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD, he had assumed a Roman identity, and henceforth called himself Flavius Josephus. He had made it his task to present Jewish life to the Romans as authentically as possible, although he had not been an eyewitness to the burial of Herod the Great. His records led back to the fact that, as was usual with him, he had meticulously researched everything and described the funeral procession, the lineup of the procession, the length of the route, and the place of burial down to the last detail. There was only one thing that the historian, known for the reliability of his reports, had described very vaguely, namely the grave itself. Consequently, for about 2 millennia, no one knew where the tomb of Herod the Great was located, until on the 8th of May 2007, the Israeli archaeologist Ehud Netzer finally announced that he had discovered the tomb. For 35 years he had been digging around at the mountain fortress of Herodium. But then the renowned archaeologist of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem found the tomb, namely in the eastern flank of the approximately 60-meter-high Herodium Hill, where Herod the Great, the violent, brutal, cruel, and dazzling ruler and biblical fiend, had found his final resting place.
Contact Report 703.
But now I would like to talk a little bit in detail and openly about how basically the so-called holy books came into being with regard to Christianity and Islam, because the truth is that neither Emmanuel alias Jesus nor Muhammad themselves made any written records of the teachings of the prophets. Only Emmanuel's disciple Judas Iscariot, not Judas Iscariot or Iscariot, knew the scriptures, while all the other disciples, contrary to all the conventional lies and claims, were just as ignorant of the scriptures as the followers around Muhammad. The records of Judas Iscariot, from which the book Talmud Jmmanuel was made, were finally translated into German by those who knew the scriptures, after Isa Rashid had falsified everything according to his priesthood. The Christian New Testament, however, has no connection whatsoever with the actual records of Judas Iscariot, for this corresponds to a work of lies whose origin lay long years after the time of Emmanuel and Judas Iscariot, in letters of the disciples, etc., which began to circulate, and from which the so-called New Testament was also finally made. These disciples' letters, however, were not written by the disciples themselves, who knew how to write and write, but were written works of scribes, to whom various disciples, etc., dictated their statements according to the time of Emmanuel, which were interpreted by the scribblers according to their own discretion and sense, and were formulated and written accordingly. In the process, fanciful or misinterpreting things and events were added that lacked any truth content. This also happened with the Hebrews and their descendants when the first Torah and then the second Torah were written, from which the Christian Bible ultimately emerged. These holy works were also not written according to the real truth, but according to ancient stories, fables and legends, etc., which, as with all peoples of the earth, were based on assumptions, Beliefs, hallucinations, fantasies, delusions, fairy tales, hopes, dreams, and wishes, which were nurtured by human beings over decades and centuries or even millennia. So it is also not accepted that the teaching of the prophets, or the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, as it was already brought by Emmanuel and all 4 other prophets or heralds, Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, which is now also taught today for the last time and spread by the Figui, is a teaching of the creative natural laws. A teaching that teaches the human being to live with all fellow human beings and all peoples in peace, freedom, and justice, in humanity and love. And this ancient teaching, whose origins can be traced back to Nokodemian, the universal herald who existed 9 billion years ago, also teaches that self-knowledge, consciousness self-development, good self-esteem, empathy, and healthy self-respect, etc., are of the greatest importance for the individual human being, as well as connectedness with the existence of the entire environment. Muhammad and Emmanuel, however, were in reality humble human beings of love, peace, freedom, justice, equality, and humanity, as were also the other, earlier and predetermined prophets Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, from the same prophetic line before them. And, as I said, the old 4 prophets were predestined from time immemorial, as were Emmanuel and Muhammad, because they were prophets born of earth mothers from the nations and therefore not sons of God, not chosen by a God, and not servants of God, or such nonsense as was attributed to them in the course of time by crazy and delusional people. Enoch, Eliah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Emmanuel, and Muhammad were predetermined prophets or heralds of the doctrine of the prophets, or the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life, which was created ages ago by the ever-first prophet or herald Nokodemian, according to the creative natural laws, and carried on in his spiritual lineage, reincarnating over all times. But in addition to the prophets or heralds of the Nokodemian lineage, wise human beings, female and male, also always arise in all peoples, who acquire much creative natural knowledge by their own efforts and instruct the peoples, guide them, and teach them the true ways of creative natural conduct of life.
Contact Report 706.
The teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, which was brought by the ancient prophets, and which you also teach, was completely falsified by earth humans and became confused religions, from which also many sects emerged. And that this true teaching was not written down by the old prophets themselves was because they had no means to do so, which was also the case with the last 2 prophets. Also, these 2 taught only orally, and their disciples were ignorant of reading and writing, with one exception, for with the messenger Emmanuel there was a scribe named Judas Iscarioth, who however recorded more incidents than values of the teaching. Since the prophets could not record or write down the teachings themselves, it was not until many decades after their deaths that the possibility arose for scribes to create written records through extremely poor memories and false interpretations, as well as badly falsified oral traditions and stories. In the process, these also fell prey to new falsifications through their own interpretations, which were introduced by the scribes into their writings. Thus it could happen that the old prophets, against their will, were unintentionally elevated to the status of founders of religions after their death, although this was in fact absolutely not in their sense.
Contact Report 708.
And that the nonsensical nonsense of the Immaculate Conception by the Holy Spirit of God should have led to the birth of a Son of God, should then be believed unthinkingly by the Christian believers and become a rock-solid delusion of faith that is unavoidable. This already ancient, senseless, lying Christian fairy tale story, as it was also told to the faithful in a similar way in various other old religious lies, and from which Christianity has taken over the whole fairy tale jumble, was not spread by the prophet or herald Emmanuel, alias Jesus Christ, who never bore this name, but was invented by some of his disciples only after his flight from the cross, when he was already on his way to India. He was also accompanied there by his twin brother James, his companion and disciple Mary Magdalene, who was devoted to him in deep platonic friendship. Mary Magdalene was never really his lover, but his stepsister, who held him in deep brotherly love, and was fathered by Joseph with his first wife, who came from Magdala on the Sea of Galilee and died giving birth to their daughter Miriam Mary Magdalene. Miriam, the mother of Emmanuel, was also on her way to India with him, but she did not survive the hardships of the journey and died in the north of Pakistan and was also buried there.
Contact Report 709.
At that time, Emperor Nero persecuted the Christians in Rome and had them brutally executed. The Apostle Peter is also said to have been crucified upside down, as forged apostolic writings are supposed to prove. This lie, however, served to sanctify Peter and to stamp the supposedly inverted Christ cross as a symbol of blasphemy and persecution of Christians for the ruler of the time. In Christian circles, the allegedly inverted or upside-down cross was then called the Nero cross. In truth, the cross was also not one in the sense of a Christ cross, but a natural thick tree branch with a ypsilon-shaped branch fork, as many Roman crucifixion crosses were. Peter was also crucified on such a tree branch ypsilon, erected vertically like every tree branch ypsilon or hand-carved cross on which earth humans were crucified. And the sign for Paul's crucifixion was shaped like the Germanic death rune. Consequently, it looked no different from today's insane and false death rune peace symbol.
Contact Report 711.
Consequently, the following arises because of the twin brother of Emmanuel, precisely James, are all around sometimes questions, but I do not want to answer them, which is why I do not want to talk about it. At that time, his twinship was deliberately concealed because James objected to being officially associated with the teaching.
Contact Report 713.
The time when about 2,000 years ago the herald Emmanuel taught the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life in Palestine, which his disciples and people made into a basic religion as a result of misunderstanding and misinterpretation, from which the Christian delusion and thus ultimately the entire Christian God delusion and religion delusion arose, which today comprise about 2.3 billion believers in delusional God.
Contact Report 714.
And if the Bible is considered further, then also the herald Emmanuel, who is slanderously called Jesus, Christ, and Son of God by the delusionists, taught other than a crazy prohibition of eating meat. He was neither the Son of God nor a vegetarian or vegan. This, however, in addition to monstrous lies, is also rightly stated in the Bible that he ate fish according to Luke 24:42-43, and also lamb according to Luke 22:8-15. Emmanuel also distributed fish and bread at the feeding of the alleged 5,000, where in reality and truth, a group of only a few dozen human beings was present, and thus not 5,000 earthlings. In fact, only about 250 persons were present at this Sermon on the Mount, and the multiplication of fish and bread, and only a few men were present, contrary to the claim of lies in John chapter 6 verse 10 in the New Testament. Mainly, there were only women and children who listened to Emmanuel's explanations, and also followed him up the mountain, which in reality was only a small hill. So the 5 barley loaves and the 2 fishes, which Emmanuel had multiplied by his powers of consciousness, were needed for only about 250 human beings, that is to say women and children, as well as for 40 men, but not for their 5,000. Effectively, it would have been extremely strange if Emmanuel had been a vegetarian or vegan. Also, in a vision of the Apostle Peter, it is explained in the New Testament that Emmanuel had declared all food to be pure, including the flesh of animals, as can be looked up in Acts 10:10-15.
Contact Report 715.
And with regard to celibacy, which you have often called illogical nonsense, as you also said in this way to Emmanuel on your return, journey with Ascot into the past, and told him how the fanatical Christian religion as Catholicism and from it celibacy would develop from his work. I also find the term nonsense to be just as uniquely correct for it. According to the information given by Ascot, who recorded your conversation with Emmanuel, he replied to you, after you had explained celibacy to him, that such a request was not only contrary to nature, absolutely nonsensical, despicable, but also such that sexual excesses and misdeeds would inevitably arise from it.
Contact Report 721.
Emmanuel, born 3rd February, 2nd, B.C. via 111, 9th May. After Emmanuel's flight from Jerusalem, his entire life history from birth up to his death was spread and later also written down with monstrous falsifications, lies, assertions, and calumnies. Thus the same happened with Muhammad, whose real name indeed was Abdul Qasim Muhammad ibn Abdullah. In Emmanuel's case, only Judas Iscariot was well versed in writing. However, neither any female nor male member of his discipleship, which included more persons than just the 12 listed in the New Testament, which is full of inventions, falsifications, wrong commemorative claims, interpretations, and lies. In addition, the individual chapters, assertions, claims, and recollections, etc. of this work of lies were not written until many years after his flight, by scribes, and moreover were written in a further falsifying wise through their own additional interpretations and partly also attributed to former disciples, who, however, never took part in such writings and thus did not provide any information whatsoever, out of which the work of lies called New Testament then arose. Ancient Palestine was occupied by the Romans at the time of Emmanuel and had experienced some increase in prosperity under them, even though the native population was directed by a harsh Jewish and religious-oriented rule, which is why it was opportune for the emerging Christians to devise a story of lies of a resurrection of the crucified Emmanuel and to call him Jesus. This, while southern Arabia was a very backward area at the time of Muhammad, far away from all the cultural and economic centers of the world at that time, where the human beings who were poor suffered great hardship and were only too happy to believe in and fall prey to a new religion of salvation. If the old scrolls writings are examined, which are supposed to come from disciples, direct followers and the like, as well as from direct or indirect descendants, relatives, or from family members of the two proclaimers, then all such alleged written proofs correspond altogether to only sneaky and disingenuous falsifications, wrong memories only partly true, and wrong renditions as well as very fallible interpretations by the scribes. Truthfully, there is not a single such ancient document which would be directly or semi-directly related to a person who had been in direct or indirect contact with Emmanuel or Mohammed. Claims to the contrary and so-called written documentary evidence proofs correspond to nothing other than falsifications and lies, because in the case of both Emmanuel as well as Muhammad, the first written records were made only years later, after their departure, that is to say, after their death. And this happened according to very inadequate or erroneous memories, but also through conscious false claims and lies, etc., as a result of which glorifications and fairy tales regarding Emmanuel and Muhammad also came about. In addition, various direct and indirect followers were fraudulently, lyingly attributed to the two proclaimers, who in truth, however, had nothing to do with them. Even disciples, followers and relatives as well as friends, etc., versed in writing, were attributed to the two proclaimers Emmanuel and Muhammad at all times, but out of all those mentioned, not a single one was knowledgeable of the script and writing. Judas Iscariot was the only one amongst all who correctly and truthfully mastered the script and who was well versed in writing and a disciple close to Emmanuel. Later, he was slandered by falsifiers of writings and by hangers-on, just as the name of Jesus was then also imputed to Emmanuel. Though it must repeatedly be made clear that everything was the same with Muhammad and Emmanuel, although concerning Emmanuel, it was Judas Iscariot, who was well versed in scriptar writing and written language, and who made the Chronicles, from which the Talmud then arose through your and the group members' efforts, which in the end had to be correctly translated and revised by our script and language experts or specialists, because the priest Isa Rashid had translated it wrongly according to his Christian deluded belief. 264. This. While all other records concerning the teaching of Emmanuel and Muhammad were in no way made by any of their disciples or direct or indirect descendants, etc., but by strangers, namely even only a long time after their death. This, while all other records concerning the teaching of Emmanuel and Muhammad were in no way made by any of their disciples or direct or indirect descendants, etc., but by strangers, namely even only a long time after their death. Truthfully, however, in relation to the two of them and their teaching, which on both sides was the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, everything was abysmally misunderstood and boundlessly falsified beyond recognition. This also applies to various other ancient and newly discovered old writings, which likewise do not lead back to any disciples during the lifetime of Emmanuel, or to direct followers or relatives and so forth of Muhammad.
Contact Report 754.
This, then, is the Christian God, as he was imagined by the forebears some 4,500 years ago, although everything written in all religious books, be it Torah, Bible, Quran, etc., all of which circulate among the faithful as holy books, but were never taught, brought, or written by preachers and prophets, but only centuries after their death by some scribblers. All of these fell back on traditional legends, fairy tales, stories and teachings which have been falsified, reinterpreted, and interspersed with unparalleled falsehoods over and over again, and stylized up to the point of a mere religious rendition of lies. Emmanuel and Muhammad, whose teachings and work, etc., have been abysmally falsified in the course of time and already during their lifetime, as well as especially long after their death, and statements have been denied, fantasized, attributed to them in their mouths, and holy books have been made out of them, which are so full of ashen lies and slander that they cannot be surpassed by the greatest efforts. The greater part of all alleged traditions correspond in truth to unparalleled untruths, which, as Siddhartha himself expressed, correspond to an unpardonable shamefulness, just as Emmanuel and Muhammad expressed themselves in a similar way about all that has been fabricated from their teachings by lies, falsifications, fraud, malice, misunderstanding, and fanaticism, etc., and has led to a delusional religion of God. Then I have another question, namely whether you found out and now know the name of the Ishwish that was assigned to Emmanuel.
Yes, I am now aware of that. It was Helionon, whose name means the sun-like radiant one.
Contact Report 758.
Christianity, which began with an attempted murder when the Romans crucified Emmanuel and he allegedly died. If we were to believe the mendacious Bible book account, which is a fraud, because Emmanuel, alias Jesus, did not die on the cross, but was only mistakenly declared dead. But then, when he awoke in the burial cave, was able to escape with the help of his disciples to Srinagar, where he died at the age of 111. And just so, with regard to Christianity, this effectively evil has ultimately spread over the entire earth in the alleged name and according to the will and protection, as well as the love of a murderous God and faith in this imaginary fantasy figure. In the process, Christianity, and through its delusion of God and human beings, has wreaked havoc and, like no other religion, has committed murder, war, robber barbarism and rape through crusades, terror, conquests, witch massacres, murderous raids, sex orgy murders, faith ritual murders, but also homosexual murders, murders of illegitimate nuns' babies in women's convents, as well as murders of people of other faiths, and so on.
Contact Report 760.
Every religion, every sect, and every belief in an imaginary and therefore non-existent God, or otherwise in an alleged higher power that rules and directs everything, lives and exists on the one hand solely from the stupidity, which corresponds to nothing other than non-thinking, of the believing human beings. On the other hand, every religion, every sect, and every belief in an imaginary and therefore non-existent God lives on the promise of lies given by religion that God, the Lord, will reward the good behavior of human beings in any case if they pray diligently to Him, or if He Himself, or in the case of Christianity, His alleged Son, is worshipped and idolized. This, just as God also shows mercy when people diligently visit the place of worship, or, depending on their faith, beg the pew or press their face into the dirt, and hefty large sums of money are donated as often as possible, so that the religious leaders of all kinds can keep themselves healthy at the expense of the faithful and lead a good life. The lie of faith that Emmanuel alias Jesus is supposed to have said, "I am the light of life," which he never said, but truth alone is the light of life.
Contact Report 770.
Christians have the audacity to declare the human Son Emmanuel as the Son of God, and to worship Him as a holy Savior, a human being who vehemently resisted this, but in vain, for the Christian's delusion of faith is stronger, for they cling with all their might to the delusion of God. It is true that the Jews are still waiting for their one Messiah, for someone who will save and redeem them from evil and from the evils of the world, but they will wait until all eternity, in vain, because He will never appear, because He corresponds just as much to a fantasy being as God, Allah, and Adonai Jehovah. This was also the case with the first Christians, who originally adhered to Judaism and waited for a holy Messiah, but forgot about Him when they met Emmanuel, whom they simply called Jesus, and became believers in the delusion that Jesus was the Messiah prophesied to them by fantasists and liars.
Contact Report 797.
All the good teachings of the old prophets were fundamentally falsified by liars and deceivers at all times, even during the lifetime of the bringers of the teachings, but even more so after their demise, because the falsifiers no longer had any inhibitions to interpret everything according to their own meaning and to give free rein to their fantasies. In part, the old prophets themselves were fantasized into gods, such as Emmanuel note Billy, Jesus Christ as the Son of God, so that the most diverse religions, sects, and false teachings came into being, through which the truth of reality was never able to penetrate.
Contact Report 811.
The original reason was that a hatred arose that became more and more widespread, which was based on the fact that Emmanuel, Jesus, as he is wrongly called, although he never bore this name, was crucified, or rather that the Jews caused the crucifixion of Christ. This led to the Jews being called God-killers, persecuted and murdered, which led to the mass murder of them in the Third World War and cost the lives of millions of believers in the Jews. The hatred has maddeningly persisted to this day, even though not a single Jewish-believing human being was involved in the crucifixion of Emmanuel. Emmanuel was not crucified by any Jewish believers, but solely by Romans who truthfully executed him because he railed against their religion, the faith of polytheistic universalism. Emmanuel taught the teaching of the truth, teaching of the creation energy, teaching of the life, which was destructive to the Romans, and therefore Emmanuel was considered an enemy of the state. This is the real truth that must now be told after all, for truthfully, polytheistic universalism was the reason that the Romans were able to spread their empire over the whole of the then-known world. Emmanuel was a danger to the continued existence of the Roman religion and the expansion of the Roman Empire, which is why he was sought out, hunted down, and ultimately crucified. Consequently, the Jews had nothing at all to do with anything. Everything from the very beginning was nothing but an evil invention of the early Christians, who freely invented everything and attributed it to the Jews, whose foremost, the high priests, etc., were of course also against the teaching of Emmanuel and hated him, complained to the Supreme Roman and found a hearing, because he could blame the Jews for everything. The real reason for the persecution and crucifixion, however, was the Roman religion, which attacked Emmanuel and rebelled against it with the teaching of truth.
Contact Report 819.
However, we don't need to talk about that any further, but something else, namely especially with regard to the term spirit, which is why I am often called or asked. Emmanuel neither knew nor ever used this term, for he always and exclusively spoke of creative power. The term, that is to say the word spirit, was only invented later and falsely adopted in the works of religion, etc. The word spirit is falsified. The word spirit is falsely derived from the Indo-Germanic language and has been spread all over the world, namely from the term geist, whereby this word means something completely different than creation energy, that is to say, creation power, as Emmanuel, as allegedly Jesus Christ, truly used it. He never used the word spirit, which in its original Indo-Germanic meaning has no connection with creative power, but geist, that is to say the spirit fabricated from it, has the meaning of seized, excited, horrified, shuddering, frightened, and upset.
Contact Report 823.
Now as for Emmanuel, his name was really Emmanuel, but not Jesus, as was imputed to him and is still imputed to him today. He was crucified through the fault of 3 high priests, as well as that of a small fanatical group of believers. There were about 10 or 12 people, fanatical followers of the high priests. He was accused by them as an alleged blasphemer of the truth and blasphemer of the doctrine of the Jewish religion to the chief of the Roman occupiers, to Pilate. The 3 high priests and the few fanatical followers from the people succeeded in persuading Pilate that Emmanuel was a criminal against the teaching of Adonai, that is to say, Jod. He should therefore be sentenced to death. Pilate did not want this, because he saw no guilt in Emmanuel, but after the efforts of the 3 priests and their fanatical followers, he finally gave in and shifted the blame for the execution onto the Jewish high priests and their fanatical followers, because the Jewish religious law of that time supposedly demanded this punishment, which however corresponded to a lie of the high priests. The fact that the majority of the Jewish people actually saw Emmanuel as a prophesied prophet, that they had been expecting him and waiting for his teaching, corresponded to the facts. The teaching that Emmanuel taught, however, which was completely different from the one that had been handed down infinitely distorted since ancient times, endangered them, and consequently also the high priesthood, because the teaching that Emmanuel brought threatened to dissolve the faith. Therefore, Emmanuel was accused with lies of being a traitor to doctrine and sentenced to death. However, in reality and truth, he was not nailed to a cross, but to a long U-shaped execution stake, on which he fainted deeply after hours and was considered dead, which is why his followers were allowed to take him down and lay him to rest in a cave outside the city walls of Jerusalem. There, however, he was secretly nursed, and when he regained enough strength to walk, he fled from Jerusalem to Damascus, then northwards to the Greek city of Myra, and then further eastwards until he reached Kashmir, where he was called Yuz Asaph, and where he continued to spread the teaching, which was distorted ad infinitum. Actually, no one knows today why anti-Judaism, why hatred of Jews arose. The consequence of Emmanuel's execution was, what started early on, that the later followers of Emmanuel accused the whole nation of Jews of murdering him, although only their 2 hands full of fanatics managed to condemn Emmanuel to death by lies, etc., and have him executed. In fact, this is the reason for the hatred against Jewish believers. The people of the Jews, consequently anti-Judaism as an origin, is based on a few guilty people who were so fanatically indoctrinated that they themselves were willing to wish death on an innocent person. In this respect, however, this and that is fancifully claimed as the origin of hatred of the Jews. In truth, however, this only arose because there were 3 originators and a few fanatics, that is to say, not the people of Israel, who wanted to have Emmanuel murdered. But the fact that Jesus of Nazareth was made out of the real name Emmanuel by crazy people who did not understand him, and that they made him the founder of Christianity, actually came only afterwards, when he was already in Kashmir. The fact that many separated themselves from Judaism and turned to the emerging Christianity dragged on for long centuries. The devaluation of the Jewish faith took a long time, as did Christianity, which was able to openly break through to a faith after a very long time. That Emmanuel died for all human beings and should have borne their sins to death, this erroneous idea was still Jewish at that time, and indeed by those apostate Jewish believers who misunderstood and misinterpreted all that Emmanuel brought as a teaching. The believers who misunderstood everything, namely that the teaching that Emmanuel had taught had been dictated by God himself, had thus been completely misunderstood by the followers. This was not unusual, however, because the long-established belief in Adonai and his greatness and omnipotence did not allow for anything else. Moreover, Emmanuel's parents were Jewish, and consequently Emmanuel was also regarded and judged as a Jew, even though he did not represent the Jewish faith. He was probably understood by a large following as an itinerant rabbi, but his teaching was not, and not even what he actually taught. It was not understood that he wanted to teach the good and the correct throughout his life, that he wanted to break down the old faith structures, and that he did so by gently working towards teaching the human beings about the truth, without openly touching their erroneous belief in God. This was more than necessary at that time, because it was life-threatening to say something against God, and, in addition, to think for oneself, and not simply to think religiously. Nevertheless, 3 high priests recognized what Emmanuel was aiming at, and what value his teaching contained, which is why they complained to Pilate against him with insults of lies and demanded death. Emmanuel was never a believer, so he was not a Jew, but only an Israelite. For over 2,000 years, Christianity has concealed and distorted this truth, while the Jews have remained with their old conventional faith, because they could not be taught the truth by Emmanuel and his teachings. It was Jewish believers at that time who were Emmanuel's followers, and who misunderstood and misinterpreted his teaching. Consequently, they spread the teaching according to their wrong understanding, out of which the gospel finally arose. The whole thing was misunderstood by Emmanuel's followers from northern Galilee, and spread throughout the world without anyone ever asking about the actual truth, but everything was simply believed without hesitation. This is also why there are so few traces of the religion of Judaism in Christianity. When the followers of Emmanuel separated from Judaism, it was already at the time when Emmanuel was brought to the Y-pole. That was fully enough for Emmanuel's followers to separate from Judaism and curse those who were guilty of Emmanuel being executed. Unfortunately, the result was that many people incited by the guilty, as was customary at the time, as incitement is still customary today, which quickly creates a mob of roaring fanatics, gawked at the execution. Consequently, the followers, who were also present in large numbers, insulted the gapers and equated them with the guilty, which was also maintained from then on, and generally the believers in the Jews were held innocently liable for Emmanuel's execution. This was quickly spread everywhere, which also led to the devaluation of the Jewish faith, and which resulted in the emerging false faith of Emmanuel's followers. And it was not long before Emmanuel was ascribed a sonship with God, and his teaching, which was misunderstood, was declared to be the Word of God, whereby the false belief was formed into the gospel. With this, everything became a faith with such an authoritative character of false correctness, that the delusion arose to unconditionally recognize God as the highest authority and one's own actions as his will. This, together with the false letters that were written over a very long period of time, again and again by followers of Emmanuel who knew the scriptures, and by the followers' successors and their descendants, ultimately resulted in the Jesus faith and then the Christian faith and Christianity. Now, once again, the process of the separation of the followers of Emmanuel from Judaism and the emergence of Christianity is to be mentioned, which was a really creeping process that already began when Emmanuel was saved, not as a dead man, but as a fainter. His continued life was interpreted as a divine resurrection and spread among the followers of Emmanuel, which quickly spread far and wide like wildfire. This was also brought to the notice of the culprits, who sent out henchmen to kill Emmanuel, but they failed, and he escaped to Kashmir. Nevertheless, the followers formed a so-called early church, which dealt with the misunderstood teachings of Emmanuel and found more followers, that is to say believers, namely, many of those who saw in Emmanuel the prophet who had been promised to them. They held on to this idea, while the other believers considered everything to be completely absurd and distanced themselves from it. Emmanuel himself never gave a confirming answer to the question whether he was this prophet, but this led to the followers seeing in him all the more the prophet they wanted to see, which has remained so until today, and he is traded as the Son of God.
Contact Report 824.
This also applies to the more recent past, of which there are partly written traditions which, however, correspond from the first to the last letter to pure fantasies or deliberate falsifications, as for example with regard to religions, since, for example, Emmanuel is dubbed Jesus, and who is supposed to have drunk from a bowl of wine at the Last Supper, although he never drank even a drop of wine in his life. It is the same with the alleged lance with which he is said to have been stabbed and his death ascertained. It is true that a Roman lance was used for this purpose, but it corresponds to a lie that it was kept and later seized by the early Christians. The so-called Holy Lance corresponds to a forgery and a fraud beyond compare, just like the so-called Grail and the crucifixion nail and the alleged shroud. In truth, the followers of Emmanuel, who are called disciples in the Bible, which is anyway a forgery and a work of fantasy, since the whole teaching of Emmanuel was misunderstood and, moreover, interpreted in a lying way. Each had a small bowl for the wine, just as everyone has his own glass today when he sits together with others and drinks something. It was already the case in Emmanuel's circle that each of his faithful had his own small drinking bowl and carried it with him, because Emmanuel insisted on it for hygienic reasons and wanted to prevent the contagion of the diseases Oriental smallpox and a lung disease, which became a plague much later, but about which nothing has ever been handed down, and the zaret, that is to say leprosy, in his circle. Leprosy was widespread at that time, and Emmanuel knew very well that it was an infectious disease that was spread by droplet infection, and that the pathogen could also be transmitted via a common drinking vessel. Although leprosy required a longer incubation period, which he was well aware of, the safety and health of his followers was important to him, which is why he decreed that each person had their own personal drinking vessel.
Contact Report 827.
But what I wanted to say was, now the Christmas season is coming up again, when Christians are especially beaten about the ears, because at this time the lies and deceptions are greatly conjured up again. This is especially true with regard to the fictitious story of the alleged 3 saints from the Orient. Who actually invented this story, and when, could never be found out, but it is still circulating today, although everything is as phony as the alleged wood of the cross attributed to Saint Helen, which was supposedly to be found on her behalf. Helena was the mother of the Emperor Constantine, who in the years 320 after Emmanuel or so had objects searched for in Jerusalem that were supposed to have come from the crucifixion. In the course of time, 3 different legends arose, namely that a rabbi, named Judas Syriacus or something like that, or Helena herself found Emmanuel's burial cave or tomb again, and that the crucifixion nails were also there. But part of the cross is also said to have been there, which was never really a cross, but a yeshipt execution post, which caused the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to be built in Jerusalem, in which part of the alleged cross was then also stored. Another part was brought to Rome, as well as to the palace chapel of Helena, to the chapel which, if I remember correctly, was called Santa Croce Gerusalemme, that is to say, Holy Cross of Jerusalem. This was while her son, Emperor Constantine, was in Constantinople, where Helena also had a piece of the alleged cross brought to him. In this regard, I saw a gilded box in Jerusalem in which a small piece of the wood of the cross was supposedly kept, but Simyase, your daughter, was able to clarify in a laborious effort of almost 3 years that it was probably a piece of a Y execution stake, which, however, had nothing whatsoever to do with the attempt to execute Emmanuel. This was also the case with the nails, as well as the alleged death shroud and spearhead, which are still revered and devoutly adored as holy today, but are all based on fraud and deceit, as Simyase has clearly, yet very laboriously, clarified over the 3 years.
Contact Report 852.
Emmanuel's alias Jesus, which was never his name, teaching was falsified in a lying manner, as the lies are also put into his mouth in Matthew 10:34-37, and it is written, "You shall not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but the sword." 35. For I am come to provoke the human being against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. 36. And the enemies of the human beings will be his own household. Further, Romans 12:19 mendaciously claims that Emmanuel said, "Do not avenge yourselves, beloved, but give place to the wrath of God, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine. I will repay.'" The truth is that Emmanuel never said this, but it all corresponds to a Christian religious lie.
Contact Report 860.
It is very interesting, however, that a book is being written in America by someone, as Michael said, which proves with very exact research, if I am correct in the information, that only about 200 or 300 years after Emmanuel's birth, a religious transformation of his name into Jesus Christ took place. This, however, that earlier only and always the name Emmanuel was mentioned, and never the designation Jesus Christ. Consequently, all forgeries in this regard were invented only centuries later, after Emmanuel had died in Srinagar at the advanced age of over 110 years, very long after his flight from Jerusalem. Through the book and all the very precise archaeological research, etc., it is to be finally proved that everything of the name of Jesus corresponds to the untruth, the lie and the fraud of a sectarian delusion, namely a fanatically conditioned lie of faith, and an equally fanatic fraud of faith in the name Jesus Christ, thus to a sectarian naming. Through the mendacious name Jesus Christ attached to Emmanuel, something different and contrary to what Emmanuel really was and taught was actually claimed. Only through this did the great lie and the great deception come into being, through which this Christianity began to dominate the believing human beings in the whole world. In this manner, other Christian sects and other religions were built up in lies and spread worldwide, contrary to what corresponded and corresponds to the effective truth, just as everything of this kind is still practiced today by millions of fanatically religious human beings. Now, the naming of Emmanuel was always and from the very beginning alone correct, but not the false and invented naming Jesus Christ. Emmanuel's name was already in use since ancient times. That is to say, at the time of the original Hebrews, who were called Ebrea, and of which the distant descendants, today's believers in the Jews, no longer know anything, because there are absolutely no more traditions about it. So this was the name used by the ancient, that is to say, the primitive Hebrews, as later also the name Emmanuel, although it was not written with a J but with an I, as it was also wrongly defined as God is or so, but correctly had and has the meaning teacher in the deepest sense. This, as the prophet Isaiah already taught, who prophesied Emmanuel, and also called him Emmanuel, but never Son of God or Jesus Christ, etc., which, however, happened thoroughly later by delusional liars and deceivers. Consequently, the name Emmanuel was falsified by religious fanatics to Jesus Christ. This name has been preserved ever since, because it has always been used as a result of the lies and deception, and no one has ever asked whether the name is correct or not. The brazen lie of the falsification of the name Jesus Christ could not be proven by the people, because at that time the people in all countries on earth were not yet knowledgeable of the Scriptures, and very uneducated, which is also often the case today with many human beings who are simply called illiterate and stupid. Consequently, they did not think for themselves, but only believed. So these human beings were only illusory thinkers, and could not fathom what the real truth was. So Jesus Christ was never Emmanuel's name, but this was truthfully attributed to him only about 200 or 300 years after his death by fanatical believers, and with this new naming stamped the Son of God and made into a saint, which he never was.